Set adrift in an ancient culture, an unwelcome stranger must adapt or die. The Seaborne, a conversation with Andrew Rivett and his wife, Gillian Paschkes-Bell, about Andrew's book, The Seabourn, with me, Joe Parsons, and Viv Little of the School of Christian Mysticism. Andrew reads from his book.
A year. A whole year and more had passed since that confused awakening in the dark of Fengoyland's house. A year in which he had learned a new language from nothing. He could continue a surprisingly complicated conversation, accented no doubt, and with the occasional rather strange phrase, but completely understandable. And he could hear all but the rough dialects of the shepherds who spent the whole summer on the high grazings with their flocks. But even Michael the Shereg had to listen carefully to them. A year in which he had slowly absorbed a culture at once foreign to him, but also strangely familiar, as if it had lain deep below his awareness, like a long-forgotten song learned in childhood, reawoken in an accidental chord, an unintended cadence. No, he reflected, it wasn't perfect. What people was. He saw the limitations that women were under, even such adventurous women as Morag. Most seemed content to live within those bounds, but likely, he thought, not all. He was still learning how to behave in this new world. He knew he sometimes appeared awkward, clumsy, rude. He felt people's willingness to overlook his blunders with maybe a word or two here and there, a subtle covering over of his mistake. Yet, he was still a foreigner here. He caught himself pausing, staring into his bowl of broth and wondering what they were doing at that moment. Those others whom he had left behind, whom he had loved, cared for, respected, and could see no more. Where were they? When were they? Did such questions even make sense? He missed them. He missed even the noise and bustle of the rush-hour traffic, missed standing on a high green field on a still evening and looking out across the great city, swaddled in a cloak of brown exhaust. He missed them. Yet he'd found something he'd been looking for without knowing it. A hollow place inside him was being filled by a way of life lived close to the earth, governed by the simplicity of everyday need.
Thank you, Andrew, and welcome to you and to you, Gillian. And
I was tempted to say then, and here endeth the first reading.
well, then we might ask you to read again. So keep your wonderful book handy. Thank you so much for gathering today. You and I first spoke about your book when Andrew, you and Gillian and I were sitting in my garden. It must have been about 2 years ago or 18 months or something like that. And you mentioned that, or your garden, and you mentioned that you were writing this book, a story with meaning, and immediately that I pricked up my ears and I've read the book and of course, Viv, you have too. And we thought we would very much like to speak to you, Andrew, and also to you, Gillian, because I know that you've been very involved with the book as well and with the meaning of it, to ask you more about it. It raises such imagery and reflection and question. And Andrew, could you tell us, could you summarize for us what the story is about?
Thank you. Yes, it's, without being too pretentious, I hope that it is more than just an adventure story, a story of a man transported against his will from our own world and time into another world and time, which is something like our world, something like our 11th century, but not quite. I hope it is more than just an adventure story like that, and that it talks of the human condition in many ways. That was my intention, and that's what I hope has come out in the telling of the story. So it's about a man. His name in this world is John Finley, who basically is shipwrecked and is picked up by some fishermen in the sea, barely alive, and brought to this island where he slowly regains consciousness and health and discovers himself to be in this alien culture. As I say, it is something like our 11th century and rather like the Western Isles of Scotland. Although the island that he is on is, to quote, 2 days sailing from the Scottish mainland, and about the same distance also from the north coast of Ireland. So it's very much a world between the worlds in that sense. Mm. In fact, I discovered this afterwards, and it raised the hairs on the back of my neck. Celtic mythology does know of such an island. It's called Finkara, and it features in Celtic myth, except that it's below the waves. So it's all rather strange. So John slowly comes to terms with this culture. The locals cannot pronounce John. It sounds totally discordant to them. And so the name they hit upon for him is something like his own name, and yet it's melded into their own culture, and they call him Hjorn. Mm. And slowly it's a transition from the personality, the persona of John to that of Hjorn. Of course, there's a love interest in it as well. What sort of a story would it be without that? But also, it's a story of conflict of two cultures not understanding one another and how that is going to be resolved. And again, somebody pointed out to me after the book was written how it parallels really the story of Jesus, both in his birth, his childhood, his adult life, his trial, his death, and indeed in his resurrection. So it all gets a little bit scary around there. There we are. That's it in a nutshell, without too many spoilers.
And perhaps worth mentioning that it's also very much the transition of this main character. He's got to come to terms with, he runs away at the beginning of the story, and this is why he finds himself shipwrecked eventually. And he has to come to terms with why he ran away and the impact that's had on other people. And he has to look at his own, and how does he live with that, because he can't make it better. And he has to come to terms with his own motivations as he wants to try to bring something of our world, our 21st century world, into the world of the island. And is he doing that for the benefit of the people, or is he doing it to show off? These kinds of things.
Mm.
Yes, I think I'd like to say that the book is about much more than the story, the adventure story, and the love interest, both of which are, I think, very well done. And it made me wonder, Andrew, what inspired you to write it?
A very good question, Viv. It has its origins way back, about 20 years or so ago. I've always been fascinated by stories in this sort of genre of different worlds, C.S. Lewis, J.R.R. Tolkien, and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
And imagined what it would be like for somebody of our own culture to step into one of those worlds. What he, or indeed she, would experience, and how they would mutually see each other. And so this was an attempt to put that into writing. And it rather grew from there. I so much wanted my story to have a spiritual input, because I feel that is so important, such an important ingredient that is almost left out of our present day lives. It's a little bit like a trace element that we're trying to live without, and yet we find it is vital for our proper functioning. And so this culture has an inbuilt spirituality, which we find in many cultures other than our own. And it's a matter of John coming to terms with that as well.
Indeed. And what was it like to sustain that invented culture and language? I think it's beautifully done, but I imagine it took some doing.
Yes, it did. And again, that was an evolution. So the person who started writing that book 20 years or so ago was very different from the person who finished writing it just about a year ago now, actually. So my spirituality had developed, and that was shown in the various editions the book went through before going for publication. I wanted to get hold of the balance between masculine and feminine in the deity, which is so much neglected, between unity and diversity, which actually Christianity does very well, but doesn't take it far enough.
Yeah.
And so in Christianity, we have the Trinity, that is one God in three persons. But actually, I see the one divinity in a myriad of persons throughout our world, which is, I suppose, rather a Hindu way of looking at it. Where was I? I'm wandering off subject a little bit.
Yes, because you were being asked about building this world, and one of the things that happened along the journey, once the book was really, we'd got at least a midway draft towards the end. We happened, when Andrew was living on the west coast of Scotland, he had a neighbour who was a Scottish archaeologist. and she read an earlier draft of the book and she critiqued it. By this time we had decided, because we weren't sure exactly when the period of this book was for a while, and gradually it started to become clear, yes, the Romans had been and gone. Had the Normans come? Do they come in this culture? We're not sure. Christ has come, we hear about that. Oh, but it's, and gradually we teased it down to, yes, we are talking about a parallel world to the 11th century. And so Kathy Dagg, this archaeologist, critiqued the book as if it was in the 11th century in that part of the world, in the world that we all live in. And also because we live in Wales, we've done Welsh classes, so that's given us an introduction to a Celtic language. And because when we were in Scotland, we became part of the Celej community, which uses Gaelic and Gaelic in their liturgy. We had started to learn something of those languages, but you also offered your efforts to people who knew a bit more of the Gaelic than you do to critique it. So we fine-tuned in that way.
Yes, indeed. But I never sat down and invented the world that I wrote about. It so much evolved as I sat down and just wrote the story. Mm. And I had to ask myself, well, how would these people see a particular situation? How would they greet the rising moon, for example, and take it from there? So I never sat down and invented it from scratch.
No, I think that comes through, that it's very alive.
It was a gestation of about 6 or 7 years, and so it did grow slowly, bit by bit, didn't it?
It did.
It truly feels like your inner world, exactly. Andrew.
Oh, undoubtedly, it is an expression of my inner world. I'm sure most books with, again, I hope I'm not being pretentious, any depth, are a reflection of the author's inner milieu.
Mm. You mentioned greeting the rising moon, and as it happens, another passage which I wondered if you might read for us is Sinead greeting the rising moon, because that speaks to me of, and that page is, I'll tell you that,
53.
53. And it speaks to me of both the lovely language which you use to describe the natural, the land and the natural, the nature, and also the spirituality, which is very much part of being in that place. And so I wondered, Andrew, if you might, it's page 53, and beginning, she came to where the burn rose.
I've got you.
And if you wouldn't mind just completing the chapter, I think that would be a treat for us.
This is written from the point of view of Sinead, who is a girl in her late teens. She's about 19. She's the blacksmith's daughter, and she's sort of betrothed to one of the fishermen in the neighbouring village.
Thank you.
Here she is, walking up in the hills on a summer evening. She came to where the burn rose from a maze of peat and heather and bleaberry. The path petered into nothingness. Above her the sky glowed green. It had lost its golden glory, and far in the east the first stars appeared. Up here on the mountain's flank there was a little breeze, and she was grateful to pause. In the distance, the hills rose high and solid, the walls of her world. As she watched, a yellow-white light grew behind their black fringe. Slowly, a slim bow of gleaming silver lifted itself into her sight. A long moment more, and a half moon of milk-white metal. Then the full and radiant globe swung clear of the peaks. Sinead lifted her hands in prayer before her face. In a whisper, she recited the hymn her father had taught her for the moon's rising. Welcome, O thou silver lordling, brother of our Lady Earth. Welcome, O thou Lord of calmness, thricefold welcome be to thee. At thy rising may I call thee, at thy rising lift my hands. Little Lord of night and darkness, grant thy blessing on us now. May thy healing rays bring wholeness on our folk, upon our cattle, on our hearth, upon our houses, on our people, all thy kindness. On the womb of sheep and cattle, on the field, upon the furrow, on the anvil, on the ploughshare, on the fruit of womb and soil. Welcome be thou, silver brother, in the name of Christ our Lord, in the name of Earth our Mother. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Slowly, she bowed low to the presence before her. Straightening, she washed her hands in the elven light. She washed her head, her body, her feet. She breathed in the light. She breathed its life into every street and alley of her body. She raised her hands and circled them up and out and down, and crossing them brought them to her heart. A pause. And she turned again to her pathless path. Before her, a fading glory. Behind her, a waxing fairy lord. If I may briefly comment on that passage.
Yes, thank you. While we're just bathing in that moonlight, just such a luscious and wonderful passage. Yes, thank you. Please do comment.
I so did ask me to read that because I loved writing it and I love reading it still. It can sound rather strange to us talking of the moon as he. And yet in different cultures, for example, in German, it is der Mond, it is a masculine noun, while the sun is feminine, which seems the wrong way round to us. And yet different cultures have seen things differently in that way. And also that idea of washing in the light is a very Celtic, Gaelic ceremony, which indeed we learnt in the Celtic, bathing ourselves in the first rays of the rising sun.
Beautiful.
And again, the chant that Sinead recites there, I've tried to recreate the language, the feel, the cadence of these wonderful Gaelic chants, which I use on all sorts of occasions. So, yeah, thank you for asking me to read that passage.
Thank you. Would you say something more about the spirituality which is very intrinsic for you and which has given rise to the spirituality of the islanders?
Well, of course, the spirituality of the islanders isn't exactly like my own, and yet obviously also it derives from there. My own spirituality, I was brought up in the Church of England, and while I had various forays into other denominations and indeed religions, my home has always been in the Church of England. I was ordained as a priest of the Anglican Church. And then I sort of, it didn't fit anymore. I went through a crisis of faith in which I ceased to believe in anything except the mere existence of a deity. Mm. And from that point, I recreated my own faith. And it came out very, very different. And indeed, it is still evolving from conventional Christianity. It is, in some ways, much more pluralistic in that nobody has a monopoly of truth. Different religions have different views on the truth, and different aspects are all valid. Well, all that strive towards truth anyway. I'm getting in a tangle again. I think so much more clearly when I'm writing.
But just grasping towards this question with the spirituality of the island. So we have a situation in which the islanders their lives are informed by their ancient legends. And in a way, this is something that we've taken from the Celtj tradition, where the old Gaelic and Gaelic legends are seen as the Old Testament, and the Hebrew Bible is seen as the Old Testament of the Jewish people. And every culture has got its Old Testament. And then there is a time when there is a new awakening, which is very much connected with compassion. So that has happened within the island, but they are still guided and informed by what has been there before. And then we have the introduction of the character Mother Kalain, who operates in a shamanic way. So you see, and this is something that Andrew and I would have encountered when we were in the north of Scotland through Findhorn. So it's a coming together on that island of an old culture which is awakening to an awareness of Christ, and both of these are held together. And that's related to the path that you've walked. You've seen that happening in your own life.
Yes. What's coming to mind at the moment, Jo, is I don't know if you will allow this. If I read you a little sneak preview from the prologue of the next book in the trilogy, which talks very much about the spirituality of the islanders. Would you allow me to read that little bit?
Absolutely. Would be very, very, very happy for you to do that.
I'm reaching for it now.
Thank you.
Here we go. This is the prologue of the second book of the trilogy, which we're calling for now The Priest's Wife. So you know who is about. In Sharaland, where the school is, they are clear. There is one God, there can only be one God, and he is above all, absolute in all his perfections, all-knowing, all-powerful, all-controlling. But that is 2 days sailing away, eastward across the Western Sea. Here on the island, things aren't so obvious. Perhaps it's the fog that rolls in from the ocean, that blurs outlines and makes everything indistinct. Here, the one God seems to appear, how shall we put it, differently in different places at different times. Sometimes it seems there's an interplay between the Sky Father and the Earth Mother, ever and again making love in the rain and the mist and the dew, and refilling the world with their ever-varied children. And then again, it seems to be that there are many gods and goddesses, in the sun and the moon and the stars, in the mountains and the lochs, and demigods in the trees and the bogs and the sedges and the heather, gods of the wild peoples, the wolves and the seals and the geese, everything and every person seeming to have their own divinity. The other world is crowded with characters, good, irascible, and indifferent. But there again, that isn't really so. All is gathered into one. But what that one is, well, who can describe?
Viv, would you like to, before I...
Yeah, what was occurring to me, in contrast in a way to that beautiful, thoughtful, imaginative way of thinking of the inner assumptions of the world of the island. Alongside that, it seems to me that you recreate in very convincing detail the everyday life. I think about the weaving, the beautiful weaving that was going on among the women, and I think it was the priest's wife, wasn't it, who was producing a tapestry which was a map.
Indeed she was.
Yes.
An idea which was quite beyond the imagining of some of the people around her.
Yes.
And so Dermot, the fisherman, needs to have it explained to him what a map is. It's like the eye of God looking down on the island. And then he gets all confused and thinks that God really has a sort of physical eye and is wondering what it's all about.
Yeah, exactly. And that's evocative on so many levels. But I think also one, I felt I was living in these different houses, the way you described them, that you could feel the texture of the floor and the smoke and all of that. And did you have models for any of that, or did it just come out of your imagination?
Well, I've had a very sort of eclectic self-education in lots of things. I just sort of read things that are interesting and bits stick. And then, as Gillian was saying, Kathy Dagg, our archaeologist friend, went through the text with a fine-toothed comb and pulled out things that were clearly anachronistic, and helped me again to recreate how people were living.
Yes.
In those times. I've always had an interest in the old ways of doing things. And so I had a lovely weekend once learning how to use a scythe properly. And again, that feeds in to how the story developed in just a little way. I use that just as illustration of different ways in which this happened. I was going to say something else and it slipped my mind altogether.
But just to say
Gillian
there, it started out with your imagination based on what you've read and experienced. And then after Kathy's critique, doing further research and checking up. So just to give one good example, there used to be chimneys until we discovered that they wouldn't have had them. Mm-hmm. And had to rewrite many passages, removing the chimneys. And it's terrible the way things sort of sneak in. You suddenly discover a passage where you're outside, but you're talking about the smoke rising from the chimneys. all this has got to go. So it's going over and over the text, having started with imagination and then narrowing it down to an actual reality. And there's a model here because a book that had a big impact on Andrew was Jill Patton Walsh's book, Knowledge of Angels. And that's set on which island is it? But it's not. Whichever island it is, Madeira.
It's like Mallorca.
Mallorca, that's it. Right. But she makes it clear it's not Mallorca. So that gave a model for the idea of something that was like our world and yet not our world. And then, of course, we rely on the idea of parallel worlds. So there's a curious discipline here in that on the one hand, you've got the latitude of maybe things go differently from how they are in our world, but on the other hand, you can't have it so that anything goes, because then it somehow breaks down some kind of compact of trust. So we have to tie ourselves to the things that would have been practical and possible in the 11th century, while something very different might have happened. The Normans might never have come. And of course, they were a very long way from the island anyway, so their impact wouldn't have reached the island. But that feeds into the moment where the High Sharag is the person who says, well, it appears that you have perhaps come from a different world, but does that mean, and a different world at a later time than we are now, but does that mean that our time has got to be your time, or might we go in a different direction?
Yes, I think
I'd like to add to that, in that the process, as Gillian describes, is imagination then tempered by the harsh fact. And then I think your imagination gets going again. So we discover that chimneys just weren't around in the Western Isles in the 11th century, but there are fires in the houses. So what the heck happens to the smoke? It swirls around in the rafters, and it's actually very smoky in there.
But it does trickle through the thatch.
And it does. And so the rain trickles the other way in from time to time. Another incident like this is that we have friends. Simon is an art restorer, and he was reading the pre-publication text and was quite enthralled by it. But he pointed something out from his own experience of restoring ancient paintings, that the pigment yellow is not known in antiquity, except either as a very unstable pigment, which very soon fades, or else it's made from gold. Originally, I had John in the ocean wearing a yellow work jacket, as you would, a high visibility thing for working on a trawler, as you would have. And he's in this yellow coat. Simon pointed out that the islanders would see that as, wearing the wealth of the world on your back. And you just can't have that. It would introduce a whole wrong dynamic into the whole story. So he couldn't have a yellow coat. That had to be changed.
Well, the whole book would have been different in the terms of that world if he had. So all their interest in the zip would have been eclipsed by their interest in the yellow. Now, of course, the interesting thing is that for most readers, they would have been unaware of that detail. But this is this business of, if you're really up in a particular field, then something may not ring true to you that you can get away with almost everybody else. So, well, we were fortunate that, he read that bit, because you feel much more reassured if what you're writing does ring true.
Yeah, it's the bane of historical novelists, isn't it? That somebody always knows the bit you got wrong.
It's not only historical novelists, it's anyone who writes anything, if you get a detail wrong, somebody is going to pick it up.
Exactly.
And we have this experience because, as well as having been a priest, Andrew was also trained and worked as a doctor. And of course, quite a lot of books have medical details in them, and you're quite often concerned by, something doesn't ring true to you.
Yes, I just felt that the spirituality and the if you like the the physical reality are very strongly complementary in the way the book is written. Joe, would you like to?
Well, I was just Viv, because I think there is a kind of, I've used the word already, but lusciousness about the book, in the sense of the pure satisfaction of that interrelationship, which is, to use that word, weaving, tapestry weaving, which is woven into one as one reads the book, of the nature and the seasons and the rhythm and the spirituality and the sheer earthiness, and there's something for me very satisfying about all that, very connecting, earth to sky, earth to heaven, person to person.
I think this is something which we have drawn from our experience in Michele of honouring the natural world and seeing it as a continuum with the spiritual world.
Yes. Yes.
But there's something coming up for me, and I think it's Alice in Wonderland asking, what is the good of a book without pictures or conversations? There are no pictures in this book apart from the pictures that have been painted by words, but there are lots and lots of conversations. And I do think this is one of Andrew's strengths, the dialogue between the different characters. The characters come out. Well, that is how it seems to me.
Yes, Viv, did you want to respond to Gillian?
No, I was just saying I do think that was the case, and how you got glimpses of people whose horizon was less limited, who were sort of daring to think beyond their inherited view, and that comes out in conversations and character.
Yes,
yes.
Some people are distinctly limited, and other people, as you say, Viv, are beginning to transcend that.
Yeah.
Yes. We're coming to near the end of our time together, the end of our some lovely conversation, and that point which we've got to, I feel is a good one to have got to, because I too was most struck by the negotiation and the listening between the leaders, the priest, the Hugh and Morag, the priest's wife, the Shareg, Fengoilen as a leading fisherman, the compassion and the willingness to try to hear not only the new possibly, but also the voices of people who were not quite able to reach that point. They together they had a capacity, I felt, which I was very moved by, and I wondered, as we draw to a close now, whether you might have, Andrew, some thoughts about this is rather a big question for you, but some thoughts about our world now and where we've got to, and what might that community of elders on the island say to us now?
Well,
through you.
As was reaching its final form just shortly before publication last summer, we were in the throes of the Brexit mayhem, of course, and we are looking at a very, very divided country, where even across Parliament, people who held very different views were almost unable to talk to each other. And this was reflected across the country, with a very significant minority feeling that they had been sold down the river. And I felt that the book very much spoke to the healing of a divided society. Because there's the great conflict as the book reaches its climax about how we're going to deal with this stranger who's brought so many disturbing ideas among us. And it is resolved not by compromise, not by sweeping under a carpet, but by going straight into it and coming out the other side. We have come out the other side of the Brexit business, and not very satisfactorily as far as I believe. But we will see how that goes. And now we're into the next crisis, which is the coronavirus pandemic. And how does the book talk to us in that? Well, I must say a number of reviews have come back from readers saying how much it does speak to that, and I'm very grateful for that. So yeah, I hope that this book does speak to people in various situations, in various difficulties.
I think that this last point is connected with the fact that we've all had to stop with the coronavirus has meant that for a few months at least, our carbon footprint has gone down. And although I've taken over the speaking, this is, I know, the thing that's actually nearest to Andrew's heart. It is the climate crisis eclipses the Brexit crisis. It eclipses the coronavirus crisis, the environment, not just climate, but the environmental crisis generally. And if we're going to manage to address this crisis in a way that will enable the survival of the human species and other species, we would need to simplify our lives. And that's the aspect where a man who hasn't chosen to simplify his life, but is forced to simplify his life, then finds that actually there are benefits in the form of life that he has to adopt. Now, of course, this is a romantic view in many ways, but romantic is not necessarily a dirty word. While one friend has said, well, gosh, life must have been really, really hard for those people in those days. This is true. And you try not to gloss over that too much, though inevitably in a story, it probably does get glossed over to an extent. But although there is hardness, there is also vividness. The people are full of life. They are living in a visceral way, and they are living in a way which is sustainable. And they're willing to face the fact that sometimes that means that life is short. So it gives a picture of choices, and this romantic word, J. Griffiths, who writes the book Wild and the book Kith, very much seeks to rehabilitate the idea that the romantics have got something very important to say, as long as they also keep their feet on the ground.
Thank you.
Can I just say I'm so pleased to know there are going to be more of the books, because I think the test of a good book is when you don't want it to end and you don't want to part with it, and that's how I felt about this one.
Thank you, Viv. As I was writing for Seaborne, I realised it needed to be the first book of a trilogy, and I recently finished the first draft of the second book, and Gillian has already told me to do several things to it, which I'm now going back and doing to it as it needs to be done.
And do you have a title for this new one for us to look out for?
The working title is The Priest's Wife.
Oh, The Priest's Wife, that's what you said earlier on.
From the point of view entirely, or not entirely as it's changing into, of Morag, who is the priest's wife.
Indeed. Well, we've come to the end of our time now, and I'd like to say thank you so much, Gillian and Andrew. It's been a wonderful conversation, hasn't it, Viv?
Definitely. Mm-hmm.
And just feeling that there is within the Seabourn a wonderful hints and guidance for us, marooned at this precise moment because of the coronavirus, with very few planes in the sky, and having to really think deeply about how we're living our lives. So
thank you, Joe, for throwing me some really lovely questions, leading me out. Thank you.
And thank you for the invitation to have this conversation.
Well, we wish you well with the book, and the next one and the next one. Thank you so much. Let us end in a brief moment of meditation. And wish that this conversation is for the benefit of all and part of the one.
May it be so.
Amen.